Okay. Lionel Barber, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Andrew.
So you wrote a book called Gambling Man, which is a biography of Masayoshi Son, the founder of SoftBank. Can we just start? Can you just tell us a bit about your background and why you decided to write a book about Masa?
Well, I worked at the Financial Times for 35 years, the latter 14 years as editor-in-chief. And the question you ask when you leave is, well, what do you do next? Is there another chapter? And I thought, I want to write a biography of somebody big and serious. And who can I write about that captures geopolitics, business, finance, technology, and gigantic risk?
Mm-hmm.
And you put all that together and then say, well, is there a Western biography of Masayoshi Son? And the answer was no. So I thought, I need to do that book. What I didn't realize, Andrew, frankly, is how tricky and challenging it would be.
Why is that? Was it securing interviews and things like that?
Well, it is all about the Japanese language, first of all. And although Masa does speak good English, he was in America, and I'm sure we'll come to that, as a student for almost 6 years. But these are cultural issues. There's also, when I was starting the book, SoftBank was in the basement. They'd lost a lot of money. I think Masa is a very private person. Getting to him and also getting to people who know him, they wouldn't really want to talk to me unless they had his blessing. And so how you navigate that, and I suppose if I'm being candid, I thought, well, I'm the former editor of the Financial Times. I've interviewed Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Jamie Dimon, you name it. Of course I can interview Masayoshi Son. Well, that was a bit naive. But in the end, I did secure 4 interviews with him, and I did have the cooperation, if not the authorization, of SoftBank.
I do want to ask about your sit-downs with him. But I guess to set the stage a little bit, just to start at the beginning, can you describe Masa's family background and what his childhood was like?
It was a hard childhood. First of all, because he came, and he is, Korean Japanese. His grandfather and grandmother came to Japan as economic migrants at the turn of the 20th century. When Korea was a colony, it was part of Imperial Japan, and they lived under Japanese aliases in Japan. They wanted to blend in, but actually they were Korean. And although there was discrimination, it got a lot worse during the war, where Koreans were treated appallingly, forced labor, and much worse. And then after the cataclysm of World War II, the family moved back to Korea, but then were seen as part Japanese. They were shunned. So they had to go back to Japan, and they went to live in a slum. And Masa was born on the edge of that shanty town in 1957. The family was dirt poor. His father was selling liquor, and he was a loan shark in those early days. And yeah, things got better after 4 or 5 years. But frankly, if you were Korean Japanese, you still faced severe discrimination. So bearing in mind where he came from, he's achieved a lot.
He absolutely has. That was one of my main takeaways from the book. So his father does have some business success as Masa is growing up, and it's mainly in the category of pachinko, right? Which is sort of like a gambling parlor type game. What do you think Masa learns from his father in terms of his approach to business?
Well, let's just say a word about pachinko, because if you're Korean, there are a lot of jobs you can't do. You can't be a banker. You can't even be a little high school or primary school teacher, which is what Masa wanted to be when he was growing up. And Masa's father was in the pachinko business. That's the slot machine, gambling parlors, which actually at one point before the regulations changed, accounted for more than 3% of Japan's GDP. So It's a huge business. Now to finally answer your question, what he learned was the art of the hustle. I mean, I interviewed Masa's father when he was 87 years old. And remember, pachinko this is sort of semi-underworld, underground economy. And there he was, 87, telling me how he fixed the slot machines so that everybody could win. And then he could have the most successful gambling parlor in town, run up a load of losses. Then he'd switch the pins back. So everybody then, a lot of them lost. And then he could make some money. Well, that's Masa. I mean, I'll take the losses up front. I'll hustle. And, I think he learned a lot from his father.
So Masa, he's a smart kid, and this is reinforced by his father who tells him he's a genius, but he demonstrates some aptitude in school. How does he ultimately end up in the US?
Well, he told his parents that he wanted to be a primary school teacher and was told, no, that won't work because you're Korean Japanese. Then he talked about having a training school for teachers. No, that won't work either. And at this point, he's thinking, the only way I can do this, and by the way, a lot of great men, young man goes on journey. He discovers his hero is this extraordinary man that I talk about in the book called Den Fujita, who was the man who got the McDonald's franchise in Japan after the war and made a load of money. He's also a translator, by the way, in MacArthur's headquarters when General MacArthur was running occupied Japan after the war. Anyway, he meets Fujita, and Fujita says, you want to go places? You need to do two things. Learn English and go to America. And that's what he does. And he gets a place, first of all, at a summer school to improve his English around Berkeley. And then he goes to finish high school against the wishes of his parents. He goes to high school in America and then fast track to college. And he finally gets a place because he's pretty damn bright. He's good at math, less so good in history because he's doing the exams in English, by the way. But he gets into Berkeley to study economics. He does 3 years at Berkeley. 1 year he sort of takes out, and we'll probably talk about that, where he's basically running a business.
Yeah. Early in the book, when he's a student, and you just mentioned one example of this, you start to see some indications of his ability to win people over, particularly older, more experienced people. And he leaves them with this impression that, hey, this young kid is going to be successful. He's really smart, and I want to team up with him. Is that fair to say that you start to see it's sort of some of the things he does early in his life sort of foreshadows his ability to secure a meeting with someone and win them over during that meeting?
Oh, Andrew, you've absolutely nailed this. That's the point. It's why he's known in Japanese as old man killer, because he really does know how to seduce older men with a vision. And it's a bit of a lesson for the young founders. If you find somebody like one of the mentors was Dr. Sasaki, this genius computer engineer at Sharp, who had good connections, by the way, in Silicon Valley, Sasaki is completely bowled over by Masa. And similarly, the nuclear particle scientist that I tracked down aged 92 at Berkeley for a series of interviews, and they developed the first Masa product, which was an electronic speech synthesizer. So definitely, he has an ability to win over older people with his vision of a brighter, profitable, fast-growing future.
Yeah, and it is pretty impressive to think about. I mean, of all the students at Berkeley that are, trying to meet with these professors and maybe get jobs through them or get connections or sort of introductions through them, he's the one that seems to be able to keep doing it. And English isn't his first language either. So he clearly has some ability to just, once he's in the room with some of these folks, just sort of blow them away.
Yeah, and I think that is a mixture of flattery. That's a bit of an old-fashioned tool, but not bad. But the other thing, and much more important thing, is the sharp insight into, and we'll come again to this, but because it's a recurring theme, he has a genius for spotting commercial application of technology. So he's not an inventor per se, but when he hears about this speech translator and the chip, he says, well, this could be a great product for foreign visitors to Japan who they get hold of the speech translator and they put in a few things like, well, where's the best restaurant? And it'll come up with some answers. That's sort of very helpful. And similarly, use it in elevators. Oh, press a button. You have now arrived at floor 6. So he sees the commercial application of technology.
He does. He has a keen vision of where the world's going. Sometimes he's a little bit early, but he tends to, I think he does have a good perspective on where it's going. So he finishes Berkeley, returns home to Japan, and he starts SoftBank. So in its earliest form, what did SoftBank do as a business?
It distributed software. Now, in those days, Microsoft was selling software in Japan, not actually through SoftBank, but through one of Masa's great future rivals. But Masa spotted there was a gap in the market between the wholesale distribution and retail sales. And he inserts himself between the two. That's before he starts dealing with foreigners per se. Now, what you have to think about here, Andrew, is first of all, where does he get credit? He's Korean. He can't get a loan from a bank. I mean, he actually does, but again, that's through a great sales pitch to an older banker. But the other thing is, there's no such thing really as a Japanese software distribution business per se. So you can't find it in the yellow pages. And he has to therefore sell people on that vision. He manages to do so. And within a few years, he is number one. And he's also not exclusively dealing with a giant like Bill Gates at Microsoft, but he's positioning himself as a bridge between America and Asia, Japan. He's the guy that's saying to those Americans, just remember, Andrew, back in the 80s, and I was working in Washington at the time, I mean, everybody thought Japan was going to take over the world. The Americans were absolutely paranoid, if I could say so. Just when Sony was buying Columbia or the Rockefeller Center was bought by the Japanese, everybody was going into paroxysms of fear. Well, at that time, Masa was saying, you want to penetrate the Japanese market? I'm your guy. I speak English. You're just Gaijin. You don't understand Japan. I can be your cultural and commercial interpreter. And that's how it really starts.
Yeah, so he uses his distribution business really as a way to gain status in the computing world. And then kind of right around this time, he starts to have some health issues, right? He's in the hospital for a long time. He actually gets a lot of work done in there, it seemed like. Do you think that his health issues impacts his view on business and life moving forward from that?
No question. Because if you've got hepatitis B and you're sitting in Tokyo and you've just got married and you've got a baby daughter and another one's coming on the way, and the doctor says to you, Masa, you're 25 years old, you've got sort of 3 to 5 years to live, and you survive with a pioneering treatment, which I describe in the book. You suffer for 3.5 years, but you survive. I mean, does that not give you a sense of, hey, I'm a survivor. I can come back. That can be a good thing, but maybe once or twice, a few times later, maybe you get a little bit over your skis.
Yeah. So that's a great segue. So I think the beginning of the deal making that typifies his sort of deal making style is when he buys Comdex, which is a computer trade show in Vegas. And then he follows that up with buying Ziff Davis, which is a computer magazine publishing empire. Why did he do these deals, even though I'm sure some people around him said he was overpaying?
Yeah, again, great question. And I did track down the wonderfully named Jason Chudnovsky, who ran the Comdex exhibition. And I talked to a lot of people also who went to that exhibition. It was the number one PC computer trade fair at the time. And a lot of people thought they charged too much. But Masa understood this was a great way of building his network in Silicon Valley. Because if he bought that, he'd be the guy who'd be deciding who was on stage. He'd be the impresario. That's the first thing. The other point, and you mentioned Ziff Davis, that at that time was the dominant computer magazine publisher. He would be in the mix. He'd get the tips about what was the next big thing. And for those two reasons, he was quite happy to pay a lot of money. And Sheldon Adelson, the great Trump supporter, now sadly passed, who owned Comdex, as well as the casino scene in Las Vegas, Jason Chudnovsky said of that deal, well, Masa was playing chess while Sheldon was only playing checkers.
That's a recurring theme throughout the book, that when he does these deals and he maybe overpays compared to what other people would be willing to pay, he is playing a different game than everyone else. It makes it work for him some portion of the time. As he's building SoftBank, he's doing deals like this. What is happening in Japan economically that gives him access to capital at a very low cost?
Well, this is a critical dimension to the Masa story. And a lot of people say, hey, listen, did he just get lucky? I think it's more than luck, because there's savvy, like we talked on the Comdex deal. But if you see what happened to Japan in those days, the economy is flat on its back because you've just had the stock market and real estate bubble. Japan was a bubble economy that popped, and therefore the banking system is underwater. You've got ultra loose monetary policy and low interest rates. So Masa can borrow cheaply and for quite a long time relative to the dollar, because remember, 1985, and some people would blame the Americans on this, maybe not too much, but the Plaza Accord was a deliberate attempt to devalue the dollar against the major currencies, particularly the yen. That meant you could have borrow cheaply, and then you've got a strongish currency to buy American dollar-denominated assets. So although it looks as though he's paying a lot in terms of price, actually, he's borrowing cheaply and he's got a strong currency in his back pocket.
He can borrow against shares in SoftBank. When he's overpaying for Comdex and Ziff Davis, maybe he's overpaying, but then SoftBank owns shares in two sort of quality businesses, and then he can borrow against those shares at very low rates.
Yeah, we just need to be a little bit careful about chronology here, Andrew, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you see SoftBank only goes public on the junior stock market in 95.
Oh, right. And that was after.
So the Comdex deal is months before. But your general point becomes even more true as we go forward into the 1990s and the dot-com bubble, because number one, Masa's SoftBank has gone public. A couple of years later, goes public on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, so he can borrow against his stock. But even more important, and I'm sure you're going to mention this, he inherits and then buys a stake in Yahoo, and Yahoo goes public in 96. So suddenly he's got nearly 40% of one of the hottest American internet stocks. And, he can sell a bit of that, raise a whole load of money. He can borrow, and he's using leverage. So for all those reasons, that's when he becomes a really serious player in Silicon Valley. Oh, and by the way, he's also on the board of Cisco, and that's a century position in Silicon Valley. And he owns Comdex.
Right. So he has broken into Silicon Valley at this point. And the story of Yahoo, I mean, he got a meeting with them and basically on the spot committed to invest more than what folks were typically investing in companies like that at that time. And he basically says, if you don't take my investment, I'll go back your competitors instead.
Yeah, there's that wonderful line where he basically says, look, I'll give you $100 million. And Jerry Yang kind of goes, well, we don't need $100 million. And he says, everybody needs $100 million. And if you don't take it, by the way, I'll put it into Expedia, I'll put it into your rival companies. So there's a little bit of heavy-duty blackmail going on.
Yeah. I think there's an impression or a perception of Masa that he sort of shoots from the hip when he's making these investment decisions. But I'll defend him a little bit. Like with Yahoo, he had a vision of where the world was going. And as soon as he met them, he knew right away, this fits exactly into that vision. And there's probably a lot of meetings he took with other companies that he decided not to invest on the spot. And so he knows it when he sees it. As you mentioned, the value of those shares enables him to do other things with SoftBank.
It was definitely far-reaching. This wasn't a shoot from the lip or the hip decision. He got it absolutely right. A little bit later on, as things get very frothy, I would argue he's putting money into quite a few other dot-com stocks. Webvan, for example, some of these companies that the dog walking app or whatever, where you may say he's thinking of going on a wild ride rather than spotting it. But you're absolutely right. On Yahoo, he saw the big picture and he got it. it was a home run.
Yeah. So I think we're sort of at the point, we're approaching the dot-com crash. So how does that go for him? How does he weather that storm?
Well, Andrew, he doesn't really weather it. I mean, he loses sort of 97% of his personal wealth. I mean, this is bad news. It didn't happen in all one go.
Mm-hmm.
He is the richest man in the world on paper for 3 days from February the 15th, 2000. Then things start going down. And by the end of the year, I mean, it's really bad. But he does have some assets. He has those American assets that you mentioned. And what he does is there's a bit of a fire sale. He raises some money through the sale of shares, but also he decides he's going to pivot into broadband.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great story, and I think not fully appreciated, that even in the depths of despair, he's already looking to the next big thing. And he launches a broadband business in Japan against the incumbent NTT, which was at the time one of the, if not the most valuable company in the world, certainly in the telecom sector. And he's losing hundreds of millions of dollars for the first 3 or so years, but he makes it a success.
Totally. And really, I'd say at this point in the book, like my perception of Masa coming into reading the book was I knew the stories of WeWork and the Vision Fund and stuff like that. I think at this point in the book, I've gained a lot of admiration and respect for him. I mean, he was an outsider in Japan. He was an outsider in Silicon Valley. He broke into both, invested in some of the most successful tech companies. We didn't mention Alibaba, but he was incredibly right about that one. And even though SoftBank isn't your sort of typical company structure, I think he's landed on something that's unique.
It's a story in resilience. It's a story in vision. And I do want to say one thing about Alibaba, because he made that bet when he met Jack Ma at the end of 1999. He put in 20 million. Goldman Sachs had already invested, but then he put in another 80 million. And remember, this is just before the bubble crashes or pops. So this was not just, it was, by the way, and Joe Tsai at Alibaba's told me this in the interview. He said, it was a pretty good thing for us too that we got that money in before. But Masa held on to that stake through, he didn't sell down Alibaba. He stuck with it. And when Goldman sold out for a good return at 5x or whatever, he stuck with it, and look how much he made. Tens and tens of billions of dollars.
So we sort of skip ahead to the Vision Fund part of the book and things get more chaotic. So what was the thought or the strategy behind the Vision Fund?
Just a quick sort of mention of he builds that period after the dot-com bubble. I mentioned broadband. He then goes into mobile internet.
Yeah.
He gets the exclusive distribution of the Apple iPhone. He then goes into, he says, I want to build a global telecoms empire. He buys into Sprint. So this is the sort of period I talk about as the operator.
Yeah.
It may disappoint the listeners, but, he gets a bit bored.
Yeah.
He wants to get back to the tables. He wants to be the big investor. And I think that, honestly, is why he's attracted to building something like the Vision Fund, where he can basically do anything he wants. He's going to go bigger, and it's not a traditional VC fund. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Mm-hmm. He basically wants so much money, he can flood the zone. And I think also SoftBank is changing. We talked about how it began as a software distribution business. Then it's a sort of investment business. It's a telecoms business. Well, it's going global. So he needs to bring in some extra talent. That's why he hires Nikesh Arora of Google. So the business itself is changing. And that's all the backdrop to where somebody says, hey, listen, if you want real capital, I know where to get it, the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And so he goes out to the Gulf. They all think he's going to pitch for maybe 10 billion or 20 billion. And he suddenly comes up with $100 billion. Yeah, that's how it starts.
Maybe we can start with this. To what extent do you think did the search for a successor at SoftBank maybe impact the performance around the Vision Fund?
Well, I am unclear whether Masa was really serious about succession.
Hmm.
I think that if you look at the numbers, the number that comes to mind is 4 trillion yen. I mean, it's $400 billion of debt. I mean, it's a huge total. Maybe I need to be a bit careful with those numbers. But the point is, after Sprint, he is seriously loaded on debt. But that's not enough for him. He wants to buy ARM. We're going to come to that. The great British advanced semiconductor designer, that company based in Cambridge, England. He wants to buy lots of things. And to do that, he hires Nikesh Arora. He is a putative successor. Nikesh is an independent individual. He's running a very successful cybersecurity now, Palo Alto Networks now in California. He would have been a counterbalance. I think if he'd been involved in the Vision Fund, I think things would have been more disciplined. Obviously, I can't prove that. But the problem, Andrew, is that basically everybody was saying yes. And Masa was unstoppable. And frankly, if you've got 100 billion to spend and you need to spend it quite quickly and you're guaranteeing your Gulf core investors 7%, whatever, and you've got to make returns on top of that, the whole thing becomes very chaotic. So I think you're pointing to something important, which is, how strong is he on the management side and the sort of managing talent?
Yeah, I think there was early on in the book, I think as one of his sort of kind of early partners or colleagues was warning another one that Masa's style, working with Masa is basically Masa sort of does all the big vision stuff and then lets you figure it out and sort of cleans up in his wake. And I think there was a little bit of a connection between that sort of anecdote early on and then what happens with the Vision Fund.
Yeah, there's a great anecdote, actually, which Masa had another one of these older people, these great man of Polish origins, Ted Delotta. And Delotta was a sort of counselor and a fixer in America in the early days. And when he's about to hand over to Ron Fisher, who was a director at SoftBank, South African, talented businessman, Delotta said, I'm going to give you some advice. And he said, what's that? And he said, bring a shovel. Mm-hmm. The shovel is basically, you'll need a shovel because somebody's got to clear up the mess afterwards. So, yeah, Masa's a bit impulsive. He doesn't always do he can do detail. I mean, he can get into the weeds on broadband frequency, how Sprint mobile networks work and everything else. But on some of the other stuff, and especially on the Vision Fund, where they're investing in dozens of companies, I mean, frankly, it becomes very undisciplined.
I probably haven't asked enough about the telecom success that he has as an operator, but it's true. He does very well in that. And it's on the back of almost basically getting cleaned out during the dot-com crash. So I think maybe in his mind at this point, he's just like, you know what? I'm just going to keep going for it because if I fail, I can pick myself back up. I did it after the dot-com crash. I succeeded in telecom and I'll just, sort of keep doing it over and over. And maybe that sort of, there's a feedback loop that I think starts to develop in his career where he keeps figuring out how to pick himself back up.
Yeah. And also, if you think about it, Alibaba goes public in 2014. I mean, that's a big moment. And Masa's sitting on a lot. There's a little bit of hubris kicking in here. I'm invincible. I was right on Alibaba. Everybody told me not to invest in Alibaba. Everybody told me not to stick with Alibaba. No, I did. And look now. So I would also give some credit to some operators. I mean, I questioned some of his judgments on management, but Marcelo Clary was a very successful operator who basically helped turn around Sprint. And crucially, Masa had done a consolidation play in mobile in Japan. He thought he could pull off the same trick in the United States. And basically the Obama administration regulators, FCC, said, no way. We're not allowing you to merge Sprint and T-Mobile. Right. We're not going to have it. It's going to restrict competition. But 6 or so plus years later, they pull off that merger and it's a good deal. It's a very good deal for SoftBank. So thanks to Marcelo Clary and a few others, that deal does come off, although it looked very sticky at the beginning.
Right. And so with the Vision Fund, you mentioned this. So the investors had a sort of guaranteed 7%. I shouldn't say guaranteed, but they had a 7% preferred return. So that makes it a little bit of a different structure than your typical venture fund. And the other thing that stuck out to me was the way he structured the carried interest amongst the partners. Not everyone sort of shared in the collective carried interests. People only got carry in the deals that they did. And I think that creates sort of a chaotic environment internally where everyone's just trying to get their deals through. And it's maybe a little bit less of a sort of team sport.
Yeah, and I talked to some of the partners and people involved in the Vision Fund around the world, and there was a lot of bitterness about that. In fairness, we haven't mentioned him yet because he's a great figure in the book. Rajiv Misra, this financial magician, ex-Deutsche Bank trader, by the way, made a load of money on The Big Short. He ran that team. And I mentioned that in the global financial crisis, he was a commercial lender to Masa in the early 2000s. He introduced him to India and also ex-Deutsche Bank. There's a whole Deutsche Bank. I almost said the word mafia. I meant network that appears in this book. And Rajiv, he did the whole company securitization at Sprint. He's the man who helps get Masa the entree to the Middle East and the Gulf. And he's put in charge of the Vision Fund. Now, Rajiv is a very talented man. Is he the greatest, most disciplined manager, particularly of people? Not so much. But he made a very valid point. He warned Masa that if you mess around with the carried interest, you're going to have division and you're going to reduce incentives. But Masa, I think, report this in the book, he basically said, well, I found all these companies. What are with this? We don't need it. But it was a recipe for division between Tokyo, London, New York, and particularly California.
So I think the Vision Fund, is looked at as something that was not successful today, although there is still a possibility there might be the next Alibaba sitting in that portfolio. We just don't quite know yet. One of the companies that he did invested sort of during that time is ARM. And ARM seems to be the sort of power law winner from his investing period then. So can you describe what ARM does and why it's particularly relevant today?
Yeah, based in Cambridge, England, but also has a very important, increasingly important operation in California. And essentially, they do the design for these advanced semiconductor chips, and they sell to everybody. So they don't manufacture the chips, but they do the design. They're more energy efficient and they're super fast. And look, they have 90% or so. You'll find ARM chips in everything from nuclear submarines to smartphones. So they are really the ARM design, right? So this was a company that was publicly quoted in the UK. And honestly, as a Brit, I'm a bit ashamed to say that we just didn't see the value and importance of that company, particularly now in the age of resilience. Masa had always been eyeing it up. And in 2016, he'd mentioned it before to people, and he'd said, I'm willing to pay billions for this company. He then makes his move, and he makes the move just after Brexit, when there's basically Britain's just voted to leave the EU. There's no government. He gets it. It wasn't a steal because it was a very rich cash price of $32 billion. But if you think of what it's worth now, which is like $150, $60 billion, maybe that's before the market correction that we've just seen. But this is a real gem. Now, he wanted it. He then gets a bit bored because he's got his eye on all these other companies he's investing in the Vision Fund. But he also has a little plan, which some of his people are encouraging, to merge ARM with NVIDIA, which is this rapidly emerging, well, it's computer graphics initially, but it's actually AI plus computer chips. And if you'd done that, that would have been a hell of a company. But the regulators say no in 2019-20. So he then kind of sucks his teeth. He then appoints a very talented executive, Rene Haas, who's ex-NVIDIA. And they change the business model. They start charging more for their product, for these designs. And ARM is now a rocket. And it's one of the most important companies in the SoftBank portfolio.
It is. For people who know a little bit about Masa, perhaps only became aware of him through the Vision Fund and WeWork headlines, what would you want them to know about him?
I think that he is really driven and very, very resilient. And I think somebody said, look, he's got a gigantic chip on his shoulder because he's never really been accepted by the Japanese corporate elite. He's an outsider. He's an outsider not just because he's Korean, but because he's doing something new, like computer software distribution back 40 years ago. So that sense of being an outsider explains his motivation. I think that's really interesting to be an entrepreneur. I would also say that he's somebody we mentioned at the beginning, his gigantic appetite for risk. And I think I better appreciated that genuine entrepreneurs, look, you have to take risks. Sometimes you're going to fail. And failure, by the way, in Japan is frowned upon. So he's a man who's struggling always against the odds. I think that the final thing is that he is a visionary. He has had a great sense of the sweep of history, that the internet, the microchip, the internet, and now AI is the coming wave. And he's riding that wave. He's ridden it to great success. And this wave has changed the world. You rightly said at the beginning of the podcast, Andrew, that sometimes he's a little bit early. And I think he is. And sometimes he's a bit over enthusiastic. He talked a big game on AI. I mean, now we'll talk about it. He's right. That's why he was with President Trump at the White House in this new venture to build AI computer data centers. They're going to drive the next phase of AI. So I think he's the comeback kid.
Yeah.
And he's a remarkable, misunderstood, underappreciated figure in technology and investing of the last 40 years, which is why I decided to write about him.
So Moss has been in the news recently, as you mentioned, because of SoftBank's investment in OpenAI as well as other sort of AI-related things. What did you think when you saw the news about the OpenAI investment?
I thought, wow, the last interviews that I did with Masa in October 2023, I've seen him since, but I interviewed him. He was hinting at this, that he had a big play coming. And then I was hearing in 2024 that he'd made overtures to Sam Altman at OpenAI. And initially, I think Sam was playing a bit hard to get because obviously he was massively tied up with Microsoft. But then Masa spotted the opening. By the way, he never gives up. He's very persistent. And he was offering, to invest in OpenAI and finally gets an opening, invests 500 million or so. And then he comes in and buys out some of the partners. So he's got a seat at that table with probably, I say guardedly, maybe he'll correct me, the most exciting AI company, most exciting around this chat GPT. I mean, there are other, obviously, Palantir and others that are great AI-related companies. But he's there. And then, of course, he's got his old connection with Larry Ellison at Oracle. He's known Larry Ellison for 40 years. And so it's all coming together. And I do think that this is a bit of a plan here. There's a bit of a strategy. And he's all in on Trump, just as he was in 2016.
I do think OpenAI is the sort of most exciting AI company out there. And I think it's right. It's perfectly sort of on brand for Masa, or it's perfectly sort of within what I see as a strategy, which is buy shares in the market leading companies in the most sort of high growth sectors in technology. If you have to overpay, he's willing to do that. I think some people would say he actually didn't necessarily overpay for OpenAI, but for those who did, he has a track record of overpaying, but still getting value out of those shares, because even if he overpaid a little bit, the value of those shares can be used to finance the next investment in something like Alibaba. And so it all, in the end, he's still sort of creating net value. And that was my takeaway from this book. Although he has a lot of ups and downs, he manages to find a way. And there's sort of a through line between Yahoo and Alibaba and telecom and ARM and OpenAI. And it's each sort of successive one enables him to invest in the next one. So even if in that point in time he's overpaying, it enables him to invest in the next great company. I thought it was a great book. I learned a ton. Last question for you. You sat down with Masa for the book, I think in his home in Tokyo.
No, not in his home, in the office.
In the office. And as you mentioned, you've sat down with Trump, with Putin. How did you find Masa? Did you sense his ability to sort of win people over?
Oh, no question, he could be charming, but he could be steely as well. And he can be remarkably elusive. I went twice to Tokyo and he was too busy. That's fair enough because we just had COVID in some ways, but it's a long way from London to Tokyo. And when I complained to somebody that he was more elusive than a Bengali tiger, my Indian interlocutor said, well, in that case, Mr. Barber, you need to find a goat for the Bengali tiger. But I think I got that sense, particularly in the first interview, that if you'd done your homework and you had a sensitivity to his roots and where he came from, then he really did begin to open up. I mean, this is somebody who's a very private person. He doesn't like to reveal certainly not what he's up to or in his investment, but also he's very protective towards his family. I found him definitely charming, alluring, but also he is really, really determined. And, 67 coming up to 60, he was born in 57, so he's coming up to 68. He ain't going anywhere fast. Mm-hmm. He's going to stick around running SoftBank. Last impression was, okay, this is really a remarkable figure, but what happens to SoftBank when he goes, finally? Can it survive? Who could possibly run it? Because SoftBank without Masa is not SoftBank, really.
Agreed. Lionel Barber, thank you for writing this book. I think it's a great book. I highly encourage others to go read it. And thanks for coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very generous of you to invite me. And I look forward to any listeners out there who've got any comments, just put them up there on Amazon. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Lionel.
Thanks.